It is my pleasure and honor this evening to introduce our auditors from Plant Moran, and I'll begin by introducing Mr. Marios Dimitriou and Miss Amanda Matheson, our CFO, who will come and then introduce our auditors so that they will join us and share the 2018-19 fiscal year audit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swift, and good evening, board members. I am so happy that we're at this point, and I have with me, very excited to have Laura Clays and Jennifer Chambers, and both partners with Plant Moran. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you tonight the results of the June 30, 2019 audit. Dr. Swift has given a nice introduction, and some of the information will coincide with what has been presented. But we wanted to provide you with a summary of the results of the audit. It's worth reminding that all school districts in the state of Michigan are required by state law to have an annual audit. Dr. Swift mentioned that as a result of our audit, we have rendered an unmodified or clean opinion. And this is the highest form of assurance that we as auditors can provide that the financial statements are free of material misstatement. But in simpler terms, and to put it in school terms, this is like receiving an A. So congratulations on that successful result. As part of our audit, we also issue a separate report related to the federal programs that the district receives. This year, the district received approximately $9.8 million in federal funds, and the programs that we tested there, we also issued unmodified or clean opinions, meaning that you have complied with the regulations required for those grants, and there were no findings or question costs associated with that. So congratulations. Dr. Swift had mentioned the highlights and the challenges that the district is currently facing, and so we've presented those here just as reminders of the messaging that was also included in the introduction. I won't go through them in detail, but they're here for your reference as well. So now we'll take a look at a number of different graphical illustrations focused primarily on the general fund. So the graphs that we will present tonight will be focused on the general fund. The first numerical slide here that we have shows the general fund revenue and expenditures. It shows the original budget from June of 2018, the amended budget from June of 2019, and the actual audited results. It should be noted that all of these numbers here include additional funding that is provided by the state of Michigan for the retirement system, which is required to be paid directly back to the retirement system. This amount, which was $16.8 million in the current year, is referred to as Section 147C funds, and it's shown as revenues and expenditures. Looking at the left-hand side of the graph, this shows the general fund revenue. The district originally budgeted $248.8 million, and then the final amended budget was $257.6 million. Actual revenue came in at just shy of that, of $256.3 million. As noted on the bar chart, that's what's the hash marks with the $16.8 million, that pass-through funding. In the absence of that, in the current year, your revenue would have been $239.5 million. It's important to call this out because in the absence of this revenue, if this provision was to be taken away at the state level, the expenditures would remain. So it's important to know what your revenue would be in the absence of that. So now let's move on to the right-hand side of the graph, focusing on expenditures. The original budget was $251.2 million, and then increased to $259.6 million. Actual results were $257 million, which is just slightly lower than planned. And later in the presentation, we will get into more specific information around the revenue sources and expenditures. So this is just intended to provide a high-level summary. The next slide also continues to look at the general fund from a high-level perspective. This graph looks at, again, the general fund budget versus actual results and examines the impact on expected versus actual fund balance. So the graph starts with what the fund balance was as of June 30, 2018, so a year ago. And then it reflects what the budgeted and actual revenue and expenditures are, which will ultimately drive the change in fund balance for the given year, and ends you at fund balance as of June 30, 2019. The graph reflects that the final amended budget planned for a use of fund balance of about $2 million. The actual fund balance that was utilized was about $800,000. Dr. Swift mentioned the very small variances that are present in the general fund budget versus actual results. And while overall, the actual utilization of fund balance was better, if you will, by about $1.2 million, that's actually a very, very narrow variance. And the number of percentages as it relates to revenue and expenditures is presented up here on the screen, with it being only 0.5% off in revenue and only just below 1% off in expenditures. So again, the reference was made to a dollar and what that corresponds to, or thinking about it in terms of $100, your expenditures were only off budget by about 98 cents. So that's very, very precise. Of particular interest as well is the ending fund balance as a percentage of expenditures, which is 6.8%. It was also mentioned earlier with regards to the early warning legislation and the threshold of 5% of revenue. And so as part of that, we thought it was helpful to put in what the figure is currently for Ann Arbor Public Schools, and that number is also 6.8%. So you have fund balance of 6.8% of revenue. Additionally, you will see that we have equated the fund balance to days of operation. So this metric is a helpful perspective when we're dealing with such large numbers that are here presented on the screen. While $17.5 million of fund balance may seem like a lot of money, when looking at operating costs per day on average, if the district ceased to receive any revenue, you could continue operations for 25 days with the fund balance that you currently have. We felt it was important to reflect historically the fund balance for the district so that you can have perspective of how things have fluctuated over time. The graph starts with fund balance as of 2010 and then works over to the right, ending with your 2019 fund balance. You can see how fund balance has changed over the years to where it rests currently at $7.5 million. Over the past few years, there has been a utilization of fund balance, and while it is stronger than it was in the 2013 and 14 years, it is important to continue to monitor fund balance as you look forward into the future. At the bottom of the slide, we have also presented the historical metric of percentage of expenditures, just so that you have an additional reference point when you're looking at what the fluctuations have been over time. The next graph provides some additional context related to fund balance and certain indicators when evaluating what an appropriate level of fund balance might be. This graph utilizes the 2019 revenue and expenditure figures of the district and points out what your fund balance would be at those certain indicator levels. So there's 4 primary data points provided here. The first, working kind of up from the bottom, is the green bar. This shows what your fund balance would be when that early warning legislation would kick in, and that would be at about $12.8 million. The second level shows what the actual fund balance at June 30, 2019 was for the district at 17.5. The third level shows what fund balance would need to be in order to be consistent with the Michigan statewide average of fund balance, and that would be at about $35.8 million. And then oftentimes there, in just common discussion, sometimes the metric of 15% of fund balance is presented. MSBO, the Michigan School Business Officials, would utilize that as a recommended target. So at the top, if you were to achieve that level, your fund balance would need to be $38.5 million. The next graph shows the operating results. So what happens when you take revenue less expenditures for the last 5 years. Each individual year presented is what the change in fund balance was for that specific year. So it's not a cumulative addition throughout the years. In the 4 previous years, there has been significant one-time funding sources that has played a role in the changes in fund balance. And these one-time sources, and in one case, a use of funds, is presented as notes on the bottom of the slide, so you have that for reference. For the time frame of this that's presented here, 15 through 17, in the absence of these one-time events, the result really would have been close to a break-even position or no significant change in fund balance. So had those not have occurred in 2015 through 2017, the district would have essentially remained at break-even for those years. In 2018, one-time funding sources helped offset investments made in staff and programs to minimize the amount of fund balance that was ultimately utilized last year. So now let's turn to some specifics on the revenue and expenditure activity for the year. This graph depicts general fund revenue and other financing sources broken down by source. So as I mentioned earlier, the total revenue for the district was about $256.4 million. The greatest source of revenue for the general fund is from the foundation allowance, which represents about 67% of your total revenue. As you are aware, and I believe it was mentioned earlier, the 2 main components affecting foundation revenue is enrollment, which you have some control over based on your ability to attract and retain students, and then the state allocation of the foundation allowance, of which you ultimately have no control over, aside from the advocacy efforts that were discussed earlier. About 15% of your revenue is received from sources such as state categorical revenues, special education funding, parking fees, and other local revenue. About 12% of your total revenue is from the county special education funding. And then about 6% of your revenue is representative of that pass-through funding that I talked about earlier, that $16.8 million. So that's about 6% of your total revenue. A key component to the funding from the state is the per pupil foundation allowance. And this was presented, this period of time presented on screen is a little bit elongated from what was presented previously. But here is a summary of what the district's foundation allowance has been since 2006-2007. You were at your highest funded amount in 2008-2009 at $9,700 per student. As there was a series of cuts that occurred in the state of Michigan, the lowest level that you were at was back in 2011-12 at $9,020 per pupil. So now, fast forward to today, this year, the current operating school year, your 19-20 year, you will receive $9,530 per pupil. But as you can see, and as was mentioned, this is still not anywhere near what it was previously. Although it has gotten incrementally slightly better over the last several years, it's still not fully restored to where it was, where the beginning of the chart is. This slide shows the enrollment for the district based on the fall count each year. As you can see, enrollment changes were relatively flat in 2010 through 2014. But since that time, enrollment increases have occurred the last 4 years. It should be noted that these increases are one of the largest from both a total number and a percentage perspective that we have seen in the state. Specifically, from 2010 to 2019, you've increased enrollment by approximately 1,200 students, or 7.5%. Given what birth rates are and student counts are that we see across the state, and those are declining statewide, the ability to attract and retain students here in the district has made a significant difference. And now I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to cover some information on the expenditures.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening. As Jennifer mentioned, now we'll shift our focus to the general fund expenditures. So listed on your screen here, total expenditures for the year ended June 30, 2019 were $257.2 million. And you can see the largest component at $197.8 million were salaries and benefits. But also we need to include the item that's listed there in the green component of the $16.8 million, which is that pass-through funding you receive from the state and then also remit to the retirement system. But we broke that out separately so it aligns with the revenue source. Those two items together represent 83.4% of total expenditures, or for every dollar that you're spending within the district, 83% goes to salaries and benefits. If we look at that total of salaries and benefits, so the $197 million I mentioned, plus the $16.8, those two items together represent $214.5 million of spent on salaries and benefits. And so what we did here on this slide is really break that down between how much is actual compensation paid and how much is represented by benefits. So in the blue component of the slide, you can see that $128.8 million, or 60% of all those dollars, are spent on salaries and wages. And then another $50 million is represented by the district's contribution into the retirement system statewide. And the reason that I highlight that, and we'll talk about it more in a few slides, is that $50 million is the district's contribution, not inclusive of the fact that all of your employees are also contributing their own funds into the retirement system as well. This is the district's cost. And you'll see on that dashed line there, we again have indicated in the red component of the slide, in that $50 million is also included the $16.8 million that you receive from the state and then send it right back to them. And then you'll notice the other largest component on this slide is $24.5 million, or 11%, which is represented by healthcare costs, and we'll talk about that more in a minute as well. This slide here shows again the same salaries and benefits, but now we're looking at how are those dollars actually expended, basically from a departmental basis, and this is categorized based on the classifications that the state of Michigan provides to you. And that's done because all school districts should be accounting for these salaries and benefits in the same way, so you can provide some comparability. So for your $214.5 million, 87% of that is classified in the instruction and instructional support area, which is where you'd want it to be because those are the people most impactful to the students. The next largest component is $16.1 million in school building administration. Again, these are people that are in the buildings with the students on a daily basis, helping to impact the experience that they have within the district. So those two pieces together are about 95% of all expenditures on salaries and benefits that are in the school-based services. We talked a moment ago about the retirement cost, and so what this slide does, and we've talked about this in years past, is really demonstrate the district contribution into the statewide retirement system since 2011-12 all the way to this last fiscal year of 2018-19. And you'll see there's a small blue box on each of those bar graphs that just keeps getting larger, and that's representing those funds that are coming from the state of Michigan as that pass-through. And the reason that we continue to bring that up and remind you of that is what was mentioned in the opening comments and then also in Jennifer's comments, that if the state were to decide legislatively that they were no longer going to provide those pass-through funds, take away the $16.8 million, you would still be required to contribute $50.1 million into the retirement system. So that would mean out of your revenue sources, you'd have to come up with that extra $16.8 million. And that's something that you'll have to continue to watch on a regular basis. So for every dollar of compensation that's paid, as was mentioned earlier, approximately 40 additional cents are then contributed into the retirement system, plus the employee is also contributing to that system as well, dependent upon the plan in which they choose to participate. And that has changed over time as well. The other large component that we talked about from a benefits perspective was healthcare costs. So this slide here shows the trend that you've experienced as a district over the years in terms of the district payment for healthcare coverage for all of your employees. And as was mentioned before, legislatively, there were rules put in place that caps the amount that school districts are allowed to pay, and it's called a hard cap. So we've got there listed on the bottom of the slide that really when you see the increase from 2018 to 2019, going from 23.7 million to 25 million, the hard cap itself that the district was paying didn't change. It was $13,219. The reason that the amount increased is you have additional individuals that are covered by the health care plan as you've added to the employee count of the district. That rate is changing a bit for fiscal 20, not substantially, but it is changing a bit. But for fiscal 19, it stayed level from 2018. This slide you already saw before when Jennifer was talking about it, but we just wanted to bring you back to level set and say, what is the fund balance of the district? And as was mentioned, for June 30, 2019, you ended the year with $17.5 million in fund balance, or 6.8% of total expenditures. And you can see the trend that's happened over time. And back in those other years, 13 and 14, you were below that 5% early warning trigger. You don't want to get back there because we have seen what the state has then required you to do from a reporting perspective and different metrics, and it's just more onerous to have to deal in that environment. This next slide is brand new for you, but it is something that we thought would be helpful to you. So on the far left, we show your fund balance as a percentage of your expenditures, which we've already talked about. So that's in the green bar there. And then I know through all of your committee work and different discussions that you have, there are various districts throughout the state of Michigan that you compare yourselves to. So the next block of bars, which are on the left-hand side, show all of the Washtenaw County ISD districts, or the districts within the ISD. And these are their June 30, 2019 financial results. And it shows their fund balance as a percentage of their expenditures. Now I realize those districts are not the same size as you. They don't have the same enrollment. They don't have the same budget. But everything, when you use it as a percentage of expenditures, it tries to level it out in terms of where are they compared to where you are. Then when you see the rust-colored bars, those represent the high-performing districts. And those are not districts that Plant Moran picked. These are districts that you compare yourself against on a regular basis. Again, not the same size or enrollment, but it gives you an opportunity to look at where you're at. And then on the far right, those do represent districts that, again, you look toward, but they are more demographically comparable, whether it be by size of enrollment or size of the budget. So we thought that would be helpful for you to see as you look at where your fund balance is in comparison to your budget, or your expenditures, excuse me, compared to the districts that you look to very often when you're comparing achievement. So what are the key takeaways for the year-end audit? As was mentioned before, the success of the district is really a community and district collaboration. So whether that be in the initiatives that you pass within the community or the choices that you're making and the decisions that get made along the way, you are getting input from various parties, and you're also considering that and then making the decisions that are best for the long-term viability of the district. We do want to caution you, you need to continue to watch the expenditures for the district because those are things you have a little more control over than you do on the revenue source side of things, and trying to look at the long-term financial sustainability of the district, but also recognizing that you need to make both short and long-term investments. And then as Jennifer mentioned, you did have a clean opinion, and we look at that as one indicator of organizations that are fiscally responsible, because that means you've got processes in place and procedures in place that help you monitor the financial aspects of the district on a regular basis. So we commend you for that. We talked about the budget variances and how small those are. Your ability to amend the budget because you know what your actual expenditures are going to be is evidenced by the fact that those variances are very small. And then we know you monitor every month the activity that's going on, and that's a good practice to be in because it allows you to make decisions on a very timely basis. And all of that encapsulates itself in the fact that we know you as a board and the administration continue to look at the district for its long-term viability. So we've talked about this slide in the past, just things that are going on in the school environment in its entirety that we just ask you to keep thinking about. So you should continue monitoring those monthly budget reports. And I've tried to highlight just in the bold items, just things to pay attention to. We've talked a lot about fund balance. Just keep looking at that and balancing short and long-term investments. But really on the state economy and politics and then the funding formula, pay attention there, which I know you do. But as you know, the governor had to get rid of a lot of categoricals in the funding mechanism as she's working with the legislature on how to balance the budget and what to do. Those types of things, when those categoricals go away, those are programs sometimes that affect you, and you can't eliminate those programs immediately, which means you have to utilize your fund balance to keep those services being rendered to the students. So that's why it's important to pay attention to when that happens, because when they make those decisions, it happens immediately. And the same thing happens in the federal funding space. So if you have a grant that you've applied for and you've received it year over year, and then all of a sudden the federal government decides you're not going to have that grant anymore, now you have a decision to make. Do you remove the program that really benefits those students, or do you now find another way to pay for that, usually out of general fund dollars? So just continuing to watch that. And then retirement rates. When we look at the retirement system statewide, and when you look at the projections that they've put out there, they don't really see that funding, I'll say, diminishing significantly until 2038. And the projection used to be 2035. And the reason that happens is because of how they invest the money, the investment returns, the assumptions that they make on returns in the system. So those high numbers of contribution percentages, we're going to see those for a while. So that's something to continue to monitor, because it's not going to go down anytime soon. And so finally, we would just encourage all of you at the board level, at the administration, and certainly within the community to advocate at the state level for a new funding model. To make a change like that will be significant. It won't happen overnight, but I think it just continues to be a topic of conversation and something that needs a lot of discussion and analysis around that. Keep looking at the fund balance for sustainability, which we've talked about. And we really are impressed with the innovation that you've had on looking at what can you do differently to generate local fund dollars that you have more control over. So we'd encourage you to keep doing that, to provide great programming to the students, but also to allow you to make some financial decisions that you need to make, which of course goes right along with looking at your recurring expenditures and making sure that those recurring expenses, what impact do they have on the long-term sustainability of the district. So those are just cautions for the future, and I think you've done a really nice job looking at those in the past. So with that, Dr. Swift thanked all of you at the beginning. We'll thank you again at the end. We really do appreciate the opportunity to be here. We do appreciate the professionalism with your finance team, Mr. Demetrio, and with Amanda Matheson. They provide a lot of support to us, and they're great to work with, and you definitely have a top-notch team. And that concludes our presentation, but we'd be happy to take any questions that you have at this time.
Absolutely, trustees. Trustee Lightfoot. Thank you so much for this. I like it every year. I appreciate it. Thank you too for complimenting our transparency and our way in which we communicate how we are spending dollars. It's so nice to have facts thrown at us as opposed to assertions or just emotions that people may feel. And so when you get labeled non-transparent or all these other things, not spending the money wisely, all of that, it's nice to have these facts and data to refute that is not how we operate, in fact. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate you sharing the warnings. You were very nice and very monotone in your delivery style, but I had bells going off up here with all the things that we have to be concerned with, particularly, well, several. One, the categorical piece. I appreciate you even bringing that up. As a staffer in the legislature, I used to watch that happen all the time and have a different perspective, of course, sitting here, having to respond to that. The thing we found in the past, and you've been with us a while, is the state will not only take things away, but they will add things. And so we get in the middle going and coming as to where our money has to go. And so just because we have a dollar today, in no way, shape, or form means we will have that very same dollar tomorrow. And it's up to us to plan for things that are not foreseen, that are more politically inclined than student benefit, that are of student benefit too. So that is, I appreciate that. When you listed out long-term impacts, I want to go back. In the back, and Dr. Swift started earlier with some of the challenges that we face. There's so many others, and of course you wouldn't put it on here. We had 3 things. I'm looking at page 4, where we highlighted the challenges that our district faces. There were 3 bullets, and I ended up with a full page of additional challenges that wouldn't necessarily fall out of an accountant's computer necessarily. But federal and state funding is one, school safety is another. These are all the things that we have to pay for, be mindful of. Poverty, that's such an intangible, and as that grows in our district and we deal with that, that matters. Family factors, special needs and trauma, social emotional challenges that we've seen like we've never seen before in our young people. These federal and state mandates, third grade reading is one. The emergency manager triggers you've touched on. That matters, what we do with third graders as they are challenged as a district. Where do we get the dollars? The wraparound staff supports that we've had to implement, the social workers, the counselors, the salaries matter. We definitely want to increase salaries, but what we're always challenged with are all these other things that could come at us out of the blue that we're still charged with making sure happen. Charter schools are a challenge for us. Retirement costs continue to be. And us being a destination district is a challenge. It's a good challenge, people say, but it's still a challenge. You talk about attracting and retaining students. We have to also house them. And that, as Dr. Swift has shared, is becoming something that we have to focus on. I appreciate you sharing how we have done a good job of being innovative and trying to attract and raise our own dollars locally. The challenge we're finding, those of us who have been here a while, is we're running out of things to sell or we're running out of things to lease. And so we need a lot more great ideas on how we as a district can be innovative in that. You touched on page 4 again, you talked about that we had brought 7 opportunities in 7 years for funding at the local. Were you talking about what we put on the ballot?
Yes, that, sorry, okay. That was in Dr. Swift's opening comments when she talked about the 7 initiatives in 7 years, and that related to special ed funding, the millage renewal that you had for non-homestead millage, the bond issues, those types of things.
Very good. I appreciate that. I appreciated too on page 6 where you listed the days of operation that we would have. Thank you for breaking that down. When I looked though in the back, that was just for 25 days at 17 million. So when I go to the back where we ideally with our fund balance would be at 38 million. When I look at that, if we were ideally where we wanted to be, would that be roughly 60 days of operation that we would, if we're at 25 at 17 million days of operation, if we were at our ideal 15%, would that be roughly? Okay.
Yep.
Oh, and then the last question I have is, I'm concerned on this where you look at the orange. The green is where the state gets triggered. We are in the orange, just above where the state gets triggered. There's only a $4.6 million difference.
Correct.
Between what we have in the account and the state being triggered.
Correct.
I want the public to understand that. We are under $5 million away. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Trustee Kelly, thank you for this report. It's always detailed. But it's really good to hear and the way you lay it out, coming back to baseline and giving us the forest and then the trees and then the forest and the trees is really helpful for me. So I appreciate that. I understand that it's against state law to have deficit spending. So and I know you're not attorneys, but I do have a quick question on page 5. Our approved budget, our amended budget, and our actual budgets for this year all had us spending more than we were bringing in. And how did we do that?
So in terms of what state law would dictate, you have fund balance that you can draw from. So you can adopt a budget that utilizes fund balance, but you would not be allowed to adopt a budget that would utilize more than the fund balance that you would have going in.
Okay, and is that 5% the floor for that? Or would we, not that we want to, but would we be allowed to spend fund balance down to 0?
You are allowed, yes.
Okay, but we would deal with the ramifications of
correct.
doing
So the
so.
5% early warning legislation is intended to be kind of a trigger so that it raises some awareness around you don't want to maybe get down to 0. And so it's putting that in place to kind of put you on watch essentially, but you could spend it down to 0 and still be compliant with state law.
Okay, so it's not deficit spending until that's used up.
Correct.
I appreciate that, thank you. And then the other question I have is page 13. My question is about scale. So this purple piece of the pie and this tiny little teal sliver, those are the things that are not people. Those are the things that are not wages, they're not retirement, they're not benefits. They're the books and the salt, right? And I would argue a lot of those aren't really negotiable. You know, we have to have textbooks, we're schools. We have to clear the salt, we need the salt, we live in Michigan. But let's just say, because sometimes we get criticized for having too many programs, right? We say we make bad choices. We don't prioritize our people. And there's conversation about how do you reconfigure a budget to raise wages. And so if I'm looking at the pie correctly, the only thing that's not people is the purple piece and the teal sliver. And if we did decide not to have books and not to salt our sidewalks, my question of scale is, if we spread out that purple piece into the people, it doesn't, do the math for me, how much does it raise the amount we have for wages? I mean.
So I can answer that. It's probably mine. So it's approximately 1% of the wages plus steps.
Okay, so if we got rid of books and we got rid of salt and we got rid of the other stuff that falls into the purple piece, we could raise wages by about 1% for everyone.
And steps.
And give steps?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's approximately $7 million.
Okay. I mean, I'm happy to have the conversation at the table if we're getting rid of textbooks, but I have to assume we're not. So that I'm sure that our budget conversations will come later. But I do appreciate that, just because sometimes when we hear those criticisms, it seems like an easy thing to talk about budget priorities, but my question was about scale, and I really appreciate you jumping in and giving us some framework for what the scale of these pieces really means.
And I think it's probably worth mentioning, since we're looking at this slide as well, you mentioned the tiny little teal piece. And really what's impactful about this slide in the small sliver that's there is kind of the reason why it's not there is because of the community supporting the sinking fund and the bonds that you have. Otherwise, that teal piece would be bigger. And so the absence of that is impactful as well.
So it's a sliver because of the bond rather than a portion.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, community. And then the last question about this, is there any place, I know every district does transparency reporting, but is there a good place to see what everybody else's pie looks like? Like, are our pieces the same size as everybody else's pieces?
So it won't be in pie chart format, but if you go to the State of Michigan website, so it's michigan.gov/MDE, because you want to get to the education site, and then you go under state aid and school finance. There are reports under there, and I don't remember which one it is, so I'll give you two, but it's the section 1014, or Bulletin 1014 and Bulletin 1011. And what that does is it takes all of the financial information from every single school district in the state of Michigan, and it categorizes it. You may recall I said before, you categorize your expenses just like everyone else does. So it has numbers for every single school district. So and it comes in Excel, so you can download it and sort it any way you want, look at any county, look at anything you want, and it'll show you how they're spending between instruction and support and transportation and those types of things if you want to do comparisons. And that's the biggest database that you'd be able to find. The problem with it right now, just so you're aware, so right now you can go out there and you'll get it, and it will have all the information through fiscal 2019, or 18, excuse me. 2019 won't be out there for a while because the Department of Education cleans up the data before they publish that Excel file. But you'd have it for 18.
Okay, that's fantastic, thank you. I kind of like comparables to measure us. We measure us against SAT scores and graduation rates. I'm happy that we can also measure ourselves against the pie chart if somebody can make a pie chart out of the Excel graph. So thank you both so much for your work on this.
Trustee Gator.
Thank you for your thoroughness, for your integrity. Can you explain, you work with the district on much of these figures, you get information from them. Can you explain how you validate the figures you're given?
So we do a whole host of testing. The audit foundation is really risk based, and so we assess risk and determine what would be the areas that would be most likely to be misstated, and that can come for a variety of reasons, because it's very large balances, because there's a lot of complicated things running through it. So we focus our testing there, but we also have the ability to do external confirmations as well, which is really helpful as it relates to the revenue. You saw the large portion of revenue that's available is provided to you from the state. We're able to confirm that via the state aid status report, so we can tangibly see, yes, this is the revenue. We can also do much of that with data that's available on property taxes. So some information is able to be externally validated through other confirmation sources. And then on the expenditure side, we do a whole host of things that looks at the different categories, as well as detailed testing of transactions, just to make sure, again, we're kind of working within that lens of what would be not materially misstated.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Obviously, that's a big question. Right. It goes to your own profession. So, as I said, I trust your integrity here. Minor question. With this presentation, you do it, how much of it and what parts of it is your work alone, and how much of it's in cooperation with the district?
So we prepared this based on the information that is contained in the audit report. So information that would be projection looking, for example, the 2019-20 enrollment data we would have received from the district. But beyond that, it's all information that we have based on the information that was audited.
Right. I know there's been some changes, some emphasis, some additions based on the committee work we did that you seem to...
Right, trying to highlight the key points and the key takeaways in terms of what are the themes and really the most primary aspects that are worth highlighting in the year that just passed.
All right, thank you.
Can I just highlight one other item? So a lot of the graphs, so what makes up the revenue, what makes up the expenditures, what is your enrollment, how do you compare to other districts? These would be extremely similar graphs to what we present at every single school district that we go to, because a lot of people don't read the audited financial statement, or if they do, they don't know what to look at. So this just gives you a pictorial view of what happened during the year, what's fund balance as a percentage of expenditures. So even though we receive a lot of input from you in terms of how should we frame this out, what's the things to highlight, they're the same highlights that we're doing at districts throughout the state of Michigan, if that gives you some additional context.
I appreciate that question, Trustee Gator. This is your slideshow. I just really like it, though. Thank you for doing such a good job, because you don't always think of auditors as being this clear, and that's one of the many reasons we appreciate your work. Thank you.
Trustee Lazarus.
Thank you again for such a clear and concise presentation. It is a very tight budget, and it really shows how important our community is in supporting that little sliver. I didn't even know it was teal until you said it was teal, because it's so small. But it's very important that we continue to have this support from our community. And it is interesting that you mentioned that our district is a little anomaly in the community, in the state, that we're growing and other districts are not growing at the same rate or shrinking. So that's something in our long-term vision and budgeting that we really have to take that into consideration. Will this growth continue, or will we stagnate, or will, so that's something that we definitely will keep a close eye on. And kudos to Dr. Swift and Marios and Amanda for doing such a great job on the day-to-day basis. It definitely shows in these reports. So thank you very much.
Okay, you're not done yet. I have a few questions, and they actually arose from Dr. Swift's presentation and just a few things that we have had said out in the community. And so I just want to break it down to a common folk speak so that we're getting that message out clearly. Some people in the community have suggested that the 5% balance is arbitrary. Can you speak to that?
I can take it. It's not arbitrary. So the state of Michigan in the past, they did not really monitor what local school districts were doing with any type of specificity in terms of metrics. And then they would have districts get into financial trouble. Some districts have actually dissolved and gone away because they became financially inviable. And so what they said is, we don't want to be in the business of stepping into school districts and trying to run them. We have to find a way to identify districts that might be in distress, and those are the state of Michigan's words, so they can intervene and ask questions and figure out what the Board of Education's plan is to remain financially sound. So they decided, through analysis that they did, that 5% was a trigger. So if your fund balance became below 5% or it was dangerously close to that, they would at least have outreach and ask, what are you doing? What is the plan? How are you going to maintain fund balance? And please help us understand, because they don't want it to get too far out of control, because when that happens, decisions need to be made immediately, and no one likes what they are. At least when you have time to make decisions, you can make measured decisions and thoughtful decisions. So the state picked 5%.
All right, thank you. Over this last bond campaign, there were some other statements that were made that found quite distressing. And so to address that, the next question is, have you run across a district that has hidden funds? Was it a minor error or an egregious accounting practice? And how was that handled if you did?
No, we have not found districts that have had hidden funds. What the question may have come at, and I'll just say what we have seen sometimes, which we don't see here, is if the district and the administration are not on top of the budgeting process, sometimes they'll have surprises in that they'll have more revenue than they thought they were going to have. And so some people will say that's hidden funds. No, it isn't. The money just came in. They didn't budget for it appropriately. Because back to what Jennifer said, through the audit process, most of your revenue sources can be confirmed outside. The Department of Education gives us information, the state does, everybody else does. It's not hard to confirm all the revenue, so it's usually a budgeting issue.
Thank you. So we have no hidden funds, and we aren't practicing any illegal reporting of finances, as far as
Nothing that we
you
have
found.
identified.
Thank you very much. And then the last question, Trustee Kelly, thank you so much for pointing out the sliver. Does that also include the lights, the water, the electronics, or where is that? Like the electric, yeah. Where would that be?
So the majority of the utilities would really be in that red 13%. So
Okay.
so of that purchase services figure, about half of it is probably people related in terms of those types of services. The other half is what you're referring to.
So we wouldn't want to also take away from that red slither either. Okay.
Right.
All right. I think that, last question. Staff classifications. Where would social workers fall in that classification?
It would be in the blue section, considered
They
instructional
would-
support.
Okay, so they would also be taken. So if we added a social worker to each school, they would be eating from that same blue circle.
They would go into that blue circle, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And then interventionists, are they classified as the same thing? Okay.
Yes.
I'll
right.
clarify that those categories are state categories, so I'm glad that you asked the question. I always have to ask the finance people because it's a state dictate as to what category people go in.
Okay. That answers it for me, Trustee Lazarus.
Follow up to that statement. Is it possible, I know these are state categories, but we talked about in finance, if it was possible to maybe, separate those, so at least we understand how much our support is really costing, because we have to grow that support every year, it seems like, that we would have a good handle on what that expense and how it's growing over the various school years.
I worried, Mario, we had this question in Finance Committee. I worried that it was by hand, but you were thinking, Marios, we might be able to pull it somehow? Would you get to the microphone and help us understand
Or speak up.
how we could sort that out?
So, in the way that we categorize based on the state, we have basic programs, which would be the instruction, and then the instructional support. There's a variety of that we can separate, and then we can go back and look at prior years, and then we can compare.
So I always test you on this, but for example, a reading intervention teacher at elementary who maybe doesn't have her own assigned class, but she's pushing in to give reading intervention, would that be classroom or would that be support? These are the tests I give you to try to understand. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. But,
It should be support,
okay, so it would be support
yes.
under the state category.
So, in the instruction, you would have primarily a classroom teacher, whether elementary, middle, or high.
Including exploratory and elective teachers at secondary.
Yeah, if they have, yes.
Good.
The ones that are speech therapies and all those other that are actually supporting, they should be in support.
So is that a hard thing to produce or not?
If we're doing exactly as the state or as the audit is presented, then it should be pretty simple.
Okay, we'll take that as a task if the trustees would like.
Trustee Lightfoot.
Is there a way that that teal sliver could have the, I would not have seen that either, and I'm just concerned others may miss it. There's no line connecting it to the 1 million like it is the
Oh,
others?
yeah.
And so it's easy to, yeah.
Yeah, maybe what we can do is just add that line, kind of a little
Yeah.
arrow, if you will, and then that, because I know you put this on your website,
Right.
and then it'll be on your website.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I also just wanted to briefly address, it might be helpful to point you to page 37 in the audit report. It's the one labeled financial report. That provides some additional detail on the current year expenditures broken down into a little bit more detailed categories than what's presented on that graph that we were just speaking about. So if that's helpful, we just wanted to point out that as a point of reference.
That's great.
If there are no more questions or comments,
Thank you.
thank you so much. We really appreciate it.